is MAGA a fascist movement, or is it the opposition?
Left-wing fascism.
Some people are still trying to figure this out.
Fascists. They are fascists.
So let's clear it up. Fascism was invented by a guy named Mussolini, and he named it after the Roman fasces, an emblem of authoritarian power. In Latin, fasci means a bundle, and in ancient Rome, the fasces icon was the image of rods bundled together with an axe, representing conformity through force, strength in numbers, and power through violence. Mussolini, just as a reminder, was the Italian dictator who sided with the Nazis and ruled Italy. He'd ultimately be responsible for the deaths of 500,000 people until he was finally captured by Italian socialists and communists who hung him upside down from a gas station. So Mussolini was opposed to democracy. He thought democracy in general was a failure because it wasn't really able to crush communism and socialism, and just in general, working people should not unite against wealthy interests. That's divisive, and it leads to international unity between people all over the world, which is not good for war. And war, he thought, was good for Italians. Now, who were Italians? Oh, Mussolini believed he should get to decide who was a real Italian and who was not, which he eventually just identified as white people. And so his primary message eventually was that white Italians were getting replaced and diluted by foreign races and religious heretics who were all weakening Italian culture. And so he adopted Nazi-like laws to maintain a white supremacist caste system and defend good white Christian culture against Ethiopians, Somalis, Roma, Jews, leftists, homosexuals, anybody outside the club. And so he organized and he financed paramilitary squads, black shirts, who he sent to terrorize and arrest anybody who wasn't a real Italian, and he used concentration camps and mass deportations, and then he cracked down on journalists and comedians and artists who criticized him, and he exercised control over private corporations who were monopolizing every market from food to healthcare to manufacturing and so forth. He got those schools and universities brought under his control. The radical textbooks were rewritten to properly glorify Roman heritage, nationalism, and militarism, and he struck a deal with the church, and so Catholic instruction also became mandatory. And so now we understand fascism to be a cult of national purity enforced through violent domination by the fusion of state and corporate power with no loyalties to anything other than itself. Fascism becomes a religion, another word which means to bind. And speaking of religion, sometimes he denounced Islam as fanatical, killing tens of thousands of Libyans, and then turning around and posing himself as a champion of Islam when he thought it would suit his expansionist plans. Because in fascism, truth and law are not defined by reality, but by whatever the leader says. And to amplify its emotional strength, fascism has to be built on a myth of a glorious golden past which has lost its greatness, which is why it thrives in times of economic crisis when people are struggling and feeling humiliated and searching for jobs and meaning, answers to what the hell's going on. And so in times like these, the ruling class, who are usually the culprits behind these crises, like to blame scapegoats to avoid getting overthrown. And who were those scapegoats? The foreigner, the immigrant, the leftist, the other, all the divide and conquer tactics of what we now call culture wars. That is fascism, invented by Mussolini, exemplified by Hitler, this one blood, one language, one soil ideology that pretends a nation and its strongmen leader or leaders are the only things that can protect you and your culture and your way of life. Of course, the great irony of fascism is that it does not preserve cultures, it flattens them. For example, until a few hundred years ago, the place we now call Italy used to have 6, 7 major languages: Sicilian, Neapolitan, Venetian, Sardinian, Piedmontese, Lombard, all these languages as different from each other as English and French. And less than 3% of Italians spoke what we now call Italian. Back then it was called Florentine Tuscan. This language just named after the city of Florence, Firenze, in the region of Tuscany. And the thing about Italy that's so amazing is that despite Mussolini, half the country still retains its regional languages at home. It's spoken in families. And a big reason why is because of where the Italian unification movement came from. It came from an idea that cities and regions could unite against the domination of an authoritarian empire. And this is the most important part of the story. The activist journalist, a guy named Giuseppe Mazzini, who spearheaded Italy's unification movement, was inspired by the French Revolution. The French Revolution had overthrown their monarchy, whose financing of foreign wars had led to the starvation of its people. So Mazzini was arguing publicly with Karl Marx. Marx thought Mazzini was ignoring the corrupting power of aristocracy that was going to divide working people along national lines. And Mazzini thought that Marx's scientific reduction of people to economic animals denied humankind a moral, religious unity that could really lift them up. Now, where they agreed was in equal rights for all people, equal rights for women, the end of slavery, universal education. Gandhi called Mazzini an inspiration because Mazzini's understanding of human rights was grounded in a sense of obligation to each other, a conscious decision of the citizens of cities to work together for the common good, and that the nation was actually just a stepping stone toward a global community, the unification of all cities against tyranny for universal human rights. Now, Marx thought this was just romantic nonsense. And as a former playwright, Mazzini was a bit of a romanticist. That's why he endorsed Tuscan as the common language for Italia, because it had been used by all the great Tuscan poets, novelists like Dante, who had denounced the corruption of religion, Petrarch, who had railed against the decadence of petty tyrants, Boccaccio, who satirized power. And so this whole unification movement was tied to this artistic spirit of rebellion, of individuality, starkly opposed to monarchies and authoritarians, separatists. But that vision of a nation, Mazzini's vision of a nation, got totally hijacked by Mussolini, who twisted that concept of a stepping stone to global unity into one of regional domination, the worship of a nation whose diverse peoples must all conform to the image of Mussolini himself, fascism. So in the end, Marx had been right. Mazzini's vision lacked solidarity between the working classes of the world. It fed new rivalries now between nations. And Marx had even predicted that an isolated working class in a stalemate with its aristocracy could easily fall victim to a charismatic authoritarian who'd rise above them all, pretending to represent the people while safeguarding elite interests. But Mazzini was also correct that a sense of duty, sacrifice, and higher purpose was more universally appealing in giving life meaning than just a class struggle alone. Divided, in the end, both visions lost to Mussolini and Hitler. Had they unified, the world might look quite different today.